The following is a presentation from the MJCast, the internet's premier podcast on all things Michael Jackson.
I'm a Black American. I am proud of who I am.
Together, we can make a change in the world.
I want to see you!
I like to take sounds and put them under the microscope.
There's a driving bass, you become the bass. Let the music write itself.
I don't sing it if I don't mean it.
Welcome to the MJCast, your source of news, discussion, and interviews on the King of Pop.
Hello, and welcome to episode 183 of the MJCast. I'm Charles Thomson. September 27th marks 1 year since the first episode of Damien Shields' true crime podcast, Faking Michael, was finally released. For anyone who hasn't heard it, switch off now and go and listen to that first. The series chronicles Damien's 14-year investigation into allegations that in 2010, Sony and the Michael Jackson estate were tricked into buying and releasing a collection of fake songs sung by a Michael Jackson impersonator. That investigation took him to New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., uncovering bombshell government records and startling witness testimony. He also commissioned exclusive forensic audio testing. His sources range from former label executives to former FBI agents. The evidence he uncovered is compelling, and the series generated media headlines and charted in more than 50 countries. I'm pleased to say that today we're joined by Damien, live from Australia's Gold Coast. Also in Australia, in Brisbane, we have MJCast founder and Faking Michael researcher Jamon Bull. Joining us from Ohio is researcher James Alay. And staying up late with us from England, we have Dan Villalobos, who is responsible for the show's extraordinary sound design. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. How are you all doing?
Good.
I'll take that as a comment on behalf of everyone. Okay.
Hey, guys, doing great.
First, let me congratulate you all on a truly extraordinary piece of work. As you all know, I work here in England as an investigative reporter, and I can say absolutely sincerely that this is one of the most impeccable pieces of investigative reporting that I have seen in years. The depth of your research and the weight of the evidence you've uncovered is mind-blowing, and Dan, the quality of the finished product is about the best I've ever heard. So truly, well done to all of you. We're running a tight ship today because we have people joining from various time zones, and some people are up past their bedtimes and other people have got up early and have busy days ahead. So what we're not going to be doing in this show is going back over all the evidence already presented in the Faking Michael podcast. What we're going to be doing today is talking about how the series was made, what information made it in and what didn't and why, what's happened since the series was released, and what should happen next. I'm going to be moderating, and we've got a lot to talk about. So let's get going. Damien, I want to start with you. It's a year this week since the show debuted. How did it change your life? What happened to you in the weeks and months after it came out?
I don't know if it's fortunately or unfortunately, it did not change my life really in any way, shape, or form. The immediate aftermath of releasing it was quite chaotic because there was a huge push by me and Dan and people around us and who were working with us to try and get it out there and firstly get it finished. Like the first steps were we released, I think it was 10 or 11 episodes on the 27th of September, as you mentioned, but then we weren't done yet. We released this before we were actually finished, and then we had to really kind of chase our own tail to get the rest of the episodes out. So the immediate aftermath was like rush, and then try to get people to talk about it. In the time since it has all come out, really, my life has not changed at all. All that has changed is that I'm no longer working on Faking Michael. Yeah, I've pretty much gone back to like a normal everyday life, which has actually been amazing for me because for 14 years, I was, barely sleeping, working the most ridiculous hours you could imagine, and, putting a full-time job's worth of hours into a hobby, basically, while still working a full-time job at the same time. So, yeah, I've kind of just basically gained 10 hours a day of time to sleep and relax and see friends and family and loved ones. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
And what about the impact of the series? Has it had the kind of impact that you hope it would? What were you expecting to happen when it came out? And did it live up to expectations?
Well, no, it didn't live up to expectations. There are a couple of reasons for that. Dan and I, we did not release this podcast the way we had hoped we would. We had a plan initially to release the podcast in December of 2024, and we were on track to do that. And all of the things that we wanted to do between September and December included like a very strategic marketing plan. We were going to work with a PR agent. We were going to have articles written. We were going to have social media content, video content, like imagery and things that we're going to roll out to help kind of keep the momentum of the project and keep it in the public consciousness and try and kind of build a following and build presence online. And because we released it pretty much at the drop of a hat, really, and then before it was actually finished, we unfortunately didn't get a chance to do any of the marketing stuff that we had planned, as we tried to do some of that stuff kind of after the fact, after it had been released. None of it really came off. We did get really fortunate with Steve Nopper from Billboard magazine. He wrote a full-page spread talking about the podcast in Billboard, which was incredible, and I can't thank him enough. He did a really good job. He did a really diligent interview. We actually did 2 interviews because he interviewed me and then felt he wanted to do more interview. But that was pretty much it. And to back to your original question, am I pleased with the outcome of it? Quality-wise, as far as what the podcast actually is, yes, I'm very pleased with it. Dan did an outstanding job bringing this vision to life, as we call it, the movie for your mind. Couldn't be more proud of what the actual product is, but pretty disappointed that it didn't kind of penetrate beyond the Michael Jackson fan community bubble. We tried to design a podcast that was going to be palatable, interesting, compelling for the general public, and I truly believe we did create that. Unfortunately, we didn't have the tools or the help or the people to actually get it beyond the Michael Jackson fan community. So it has pretty much stayed trapped in that little echo chamber, and that's where it's at right now. We have hopes that there may be some opportunity in the future to bring a new iteration of it out and hopefully go beyond where we are right now. But as we stand right now, that's where it's at. And as far as downloads and listens and interactions and stuff, we, to be honest, were hoping for more.
And when you say you released it at the drop of a hat, for those that aren't in the know, just in a nutshell, explain why it is that you accelerated your release plan.
Well, it's all known now exactly what was going on, but at the time, I think it was maybe a week before we actually released it, there were rumblings in the media that the Cascio family were plotting something fairly extraordinary. We'd been spending 14 years creating this kind of magnum opus on why the Cascio family are not to be trusted and why they are scammers and why we can prove that they've committed federal crimes. And it was a really strong demonstration of who this family was, or specific people within the family specifically. And it hadn't been released. We hadn't put a single piece of our evidence out. We hadn't drip fed clues or evidence or anything. So nobody really knew what we had. And I think people had maybe even somewhat forgotten about the fact that the notion of this podcast even existed, because we hadn't really spoken too much about it in the years prior. When we heard that there was potentially going to be a big scandal in the media with the Cascio family, we were like, well, if that's going to happen, we should probably just put this out right now, what we've got done already, so that the context of who these people are is available if anybody wants to look into it. And so we did that. We dropped it immediately, pretty much. I think it took us 6 days to get what we'd already done polished enough to put it out. And then, like I said, we chased our tail completing the episodes that hadn't even been started. I think there was 3 episodes. We hadn't even started them yet. Each episode takes about 4 months to do from the start, like writing concept, recording it, producing it, and tweaking it. We ended up doing, I think, the remaining 3 episodes in a 6-week period, and it was crazy. But that's why we pushed it out sooner than we had planned. And as a result of doing that, like I said, we lost the opportunity to do all of the marketing that we'd had lined up. So, but I mean, I think we made the right choice in the end. The urgency was definitely there. In hindsight, it may not have been necessary to have done what we did, but I think, you know, you don't have your hindsight until later. So I'm still happy that we did it the way we did it. I think it was the common sense approach, even though the outcome was affected.
We'll look back to the current Cascio situation a bit later in the episode, but what I want to do now is rewind to the very beginning. Jamon, you've been involved in this project from the very beginning, from its inception. Can you talk to us about how this investigation came about and who was involved right back at the beginning of this whole project?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to just congratulate the guys because although I've been involved to a research capacity along the way, I really feel, Damien and Dan and James are sort of like the core brains trust of this project. And I just want to congratulate you guys and honor what you've done because it's incredible work. And, back to what you were saying before, Damien, about the project reaching outside the bubble. I'm sure, like you guys, I've spoken to normie civilians who've listened to it that aren't sort of hardcore Michael Jackson fans who've just been absolutely blown away and gripped from the first minute to the last minute of the whole production. And I too have hopes that it's going to spread and make a real impact beyond the community because it certainly has achieved something incredible. So well done to all of you guys. My memories of the earliest beginnings of it really just go back to my friendship with Damien. And like it's kind of explained in the podcast, I remember hearing breaking news for the first time. How I heard it is documented really well. I remember talking to Damien about it as soon as we had listened to it and thinking he was crazy. That story is in the podcast. But those earliest times really were just, us as fans talking about how something so catastrophic could have happened. And just as very young fans trying to figure out what went on, scouring forums, trying to learn about the people who were involved in this, a lot of communication between particular fans on what should happen next, just trying to find out information. I remember visiting Damien's house when we were both very young, and at that point in time, he was very focused on writing a book. There was no inkling or an idea of this would ever be a podcast. It was all about Damien putting his research down in writing as a book, because I think at the time, Damien, you were writing for the Maximum Jackson fan website as a reporter, writing on Michael Jackson developments musically. From where I was, sitting, you were working for a long time wanting this to become a book. So it really only became a podcast much, much later. But yeah, from those very earliest times, it was just a group of fans who were connected, trying to find our way in the darkness and figure out how this thing could have happened.
Am I right in thinking also, though, that this investigation kind of directly spawned the creation of the MJCast?
Yeah, very much so. Very early on, there was a group of us working around Damien trying to uncover what had happened and to get all of this documented. We used to have really, really long meetings, like video call meetings. I can't remember what we used, Google Hangouts or something like that.
I still have all the footage of all those. They're hilarious.
And there were different people involved back then. Like it was always Dan and James and Damien and myself, but there were different people that would sort of come and go. Ashley Bierce was somebody very important and involved at that point, and some different other folks. There was like a lawyer and different people.
Tom Wallart was really important with the forensic stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And we'd have these long planning meetings of trying to figure out where all this was going to go. And obviously that developed into a Kickstarter project. And I, at that point, was so interested in the meetings themselves and what was being discussed and all of the detail in these conversations. I started to think, I really feel like we should capture these ideas into some kind of audio format. Through having the meetings, I started to get really interested in tech and recording and all of that kind of thing. And that sort of just developed into podcasting. And I wanted to capture stories of people that worked with Michael. I was very inspired what Damien had done with Maximum Jackson and then his own website, damienshields.com. And so that inspired me, and the meetings we were having inspired me, and I started to get interested in podcasting. So all of that just came together into wanting to podcast. But I guess the real thing is that we actually wanted to, very early on with the MJCast, and we did achieve this, is we wanted to start talking with people about the Cascio situation. So I would interview people who worked with Michael and get on record their involvement or thoughts on the Cascio tracks. And in most instances, we would not release the portion of the interview we'd done about the Cascio stuff, and we would save that for whatever project would come later. And I guess the Michael Prince episode is the best example of that. But, you know, it's also fairly well known in the fan community that our first guest of the MJCast was meant to be Eddie Cascio. We successfully established a relationship with Eddie. I started talking with him back and forth for quite a while. I remember having multiple phone calls and video calls with him, planning towards doing the episode. It never happened, unfortunately. But the first time that I spoke with him was a video call, and I don't even remember how I got his FaceTime address now. I think I just guessed it. I can't remember, but I ended up just dialing his number, and he picked up. I think he was driving when he picked
on the
up.
ice, sliding around the road with bald tires.
Yeah, just weird. But, you know, like the first half of the call was me chatting with him on FaceTime while he was driving to somewhere, his home or somewhere he was staying. And then the second half of the call was when he had arrived at his location. So he was a bit more relaxed for the second half. And it was essentially an interview. Like when it was happening, I was thinking I may not ever get the chance to speak to him again because this could go south, this relationship. So I just tried to make it a mix of casual planning towards doing something, but also dropping in questions. The MJCast, I think, you know, we were a project that was geared around capturing evidence for what would become Faking Michael. That's correct.
James, a lot of fans were outraged about these songs, but only you little gang decided to mount an investigation. So what is it about you and this group of friends that moved you to take it that one step further and say, we're going to find out what actually happened here?
Honestly, I think it stems from a feeling of, like, at its root, just a strong feeling of disrespect from the estate. Just thinking back to the month or two we had prior to the actual release of the album, just all the cries to pull the tracks. I remember my part of the investigation kind of started on my own. I was a lurker. I still am a lurker. I'm not on all the forums. I hadn't even talked to Damien at this point, but there was a bootlegger. This was like after Breaking News had dropped, but before the album came out. I wish I had the date in front of me. But there was a bootlegger named TAC_1984. This is all in the podcast. And that bootlegger was selling leaked Michael album tracks. I remember hearing those snippets and realizing, oh my God, there's more fakes. He had already understood Breaking News was fake. Just the outrage and just the fact that they weren't listening. From June 25th to pretty much that moment, we were one with the estate, the fan community, me, I'm sure Damien, I'm sure Dan, I'm sure you, Jamon, I'm sure you, Charles. They just stopped caring. They disrespected us. And what it did is it brought us together. That's how I went from being a lurker to being more active. That's how I met Damien and you, Jamon, and everyone else. So that's what it was the disrespect.
I see it. It was almost like, so it wasn't a group of friends who decided to investigate. It was a group of fans who decided to investigate and then found each other.
For sure. The forum was MJCast, the one that I was most active in. That Michael album thread. I think it was called The Great Michael Album Debate. I think that's a later thread. There were earlier threads. It was, I mean, obviously it consumed the forums. I mean, there was no other topic being discussed other than, what the heck are we going to be listening to on this new album, on this forthcoming new album? I think a lot of fans became junior investigators looking up copyright. I mean, some of our early leads come from those days. The idea to go to the copyright office, that's not our idea. That came from, maybe Damien knows more specifically, but I mean, that came from the forums. There were fans Googling all this stuff and detailing all this stuff. So we just picked it up from there. And like Jamon was saying, some of those same fans stuck around and others moved on with their lives. And hopefully they've all ultimately heard the podcast, because it truly is pretty amazing how far down the rabbit hole a forum lurker like me was able to go. We really unpacked, I think, pretty thoroughly what happened at that moment. It couldn't have happened without the internet. Like if this scam happened 10 years earlier or 15 years earlier, they probably would have gotten away with it. First of all, it took the pool of people so motivated to look into this were so distant apart across the globe. It's us. Like we are in multiple continents here. We couldn't have banded together without the internet. Certainly the tools would not have been available to us without the internet. So, it's a very contemporary, it feels like it was an old school trick they tried to play in a new school era. And I think that was their big miss. And we come from that new school era. We're social media kids. And we didn't let that old school trick work.
Now, my earliest memory of knowing about this project was actually when it was a book. I remember the Kickstarter launching for the book. So can you just talk me through how it evolved from a book project into a podcast project?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So that Kickstarter, that's sort of like basically the beginning of Faking Michael. In fact, one of the early names for the Kickstarter was Faking Michael. We ultimately weren't funded, and we were like, one of the reasons may have been because, we unpack all the marketing blunders we made to not get funded. And we were kind of a little bummed about it, but it ended up being very freeing, because if that Kickstarter were funded, we would have been obligated to release it as a book. And Damien, you can chime into this for sure, but we would have been obligated to release it as a book, and we would have been obligated to do it in like 2 years or something. Cause that's like a contract with, thousands of contributors. So like you have to do that. And we needed 14 years. Like these facts and these leads don't just fall into your lap. You can't put a deadline on it. Okay, lead, fall into my lap now. It takes a lot of time. Getting people comfortable enough to step forward and volunteer for interviews or agree to interview, that takes time. So it would have been a terrible, terrible product. It would have been the wrong format and a terrible product and 10 years too early. So it was a good thing we were not funded.
Dan, you were involved also right from the beginning, and we hear in the show about your early efforts to secure a meeting or some kind of conversation with the estate due to the turmoil that the songs were causing in the fan community. And my own recollection is that the issue caused pretty much a tectonic split in the fan community, where everybody seemed to pick a side, like you were a family fan or you were an estate fan, and it sort of irreparably damaged and fractured the fan community, and people actually had serious fallings out about it. But I'm interested to hear from you about your recollection of what the release of these songs and the split in opinion did to the Michael Jackson fan community.
Thanks for having me on the show. Great to speak with everybody. It was a crazy time for sure. We have to sort of remember that when this all happened, all of us were wondering, how did Michael Jackson die? And like, how was this even possible? And it doesn't make any sense. And I think in a lot of ways, we're all grieving to some degree. And we were also very united in whatever was going to come artistically or anything that would have held Michael's legacy. And when they announced the album, it was just, I think everybody was euphoric. Once those songs came out, like you say, and I mentioned in the podcast, that everybody was, I think, just expressing their anger, and just all their emotions went on on the forums. I mean, you could not keep up with the amount of posts in all the threads, because it was insane. It was just hundreds and hundreds of posts every hour, and it got to a point where people were so split. The people who were very much, wanting this to be Michael were very defensive about it, saying that they did believe this was Michael, and the people who immediately believed it wasn't Michael were very defensive about their point of view. It was just a very dark moment, because how do you try to tell everybody to take a step back from it and wait for the dust to settle? But it was just crazy. I mean, what can you do? We had an estate that wasn't answering the fans' questions on one side. We had the media that was kind of running on the fact that, is it Michael's voice? Is it not? And then we had Sony Music pushing for the album's legitimacy by having the Cascio family on the Oprah show and Teddy Riley on the Oprah show and so on. So it was like, how do you fight this? It was crazy.
My opinion is that the butterfly effect of this incident is absolutely unimaginable, really, because what happened was that for the next decade, whenever the Michael Jackson estate did or released anything, you had quite a sizable portion of the Michael Jackson fan community that was actually, if not just boycotting it, then in some cases actually actively protesting against it and saying we should not be supporting or buying anything that this estate is releasing or doing. What impact do you think that the estate's failure to retract the songs had on the next 10 years for them? Do you think that it did impact on the success of subsequent projects and the amount of stuff that actually ended up getting released?
I think so. I think we saw early signs of that with the Michael album itself. I think they had one or two singles. I think Monster was supposed to be a single, and they had issues. They had delays with Behind the Mask, and they had to redo the video, and then it sort of fizzled out like in early 2010, like February. And then, I think that split in the fan community it remained for the next decade. I guess the estate, I mean, I don't know, I can't speak for what they were trying to do, but I guess Sony may have caught wind of what was happening. At least they tried to use material that they knew existed from Michael's life for the Escape album. I think had they not released the Cascio Tracks to begin with, there would have been a lot more public support from the fans, at least, for the Escape album. And maybe that would have led to more projects. Maybe that would have led to like a better relationship with the estate, I guess. Because even today, I think it's quite, it's very difficult to get the questions and to have this sort of rapport with the estate in any meaningful way, besides the MJ Online team coming in through and sort of vetting the questions. From what I hear, you can't go to the MJ birthday events without sort of getting told, we're not talking about this by Karen Langford. It's like, when can we talk about what we want to talk about with the estate? It's kind of impossible. So they have slowed down on what they're doing. Maybe they're holding on to a few things for, to coincide with a biopic next year, but time will tell.
Now, Damien, you do in the series go into, as I just said, the efforts that fans were making to try to engage with the estate and the way that the estate was just completely failing to engage. But things went a bit further than that, and there were these kind of black ops that were being run on the fan community where you had, well, for example, you had fan site owners who came out against the songs and then suddenly U-turned. It was like, what happened there? And then it turned out they'd been given a free trip to LA to some sort of listening party or something. And then you had these mysterious fans who suddenly appeared out of nowhere and became very prominent in the fan community, suddenly got installed as the moderator of a message board, or suddenly appeared on social media and had access to court documents that nobody else had access to, and very much kind of took control of the debate and were kind of launching like massive bullying campaigns and pile-ons against anybody that was criticizing these songs and criticizing the estate. And you personally were part of a group of people that unmasked one of those people who was claiming she was a lawyer. And when you looked into her, it turned out she was some kind of expert in marketing products to existing fan communities or something. So I know that you did a lot of investigation into this kind of stuff, and not a lot of it made it into the podcast. So could you just talk to us a bit more about these kind of strange things that start happening in the fan community, and why you decided not to go down that rabbit hole in the series?
Yeah, I think there's probably a few reasons why a lot of the content, what you're talking about here, and completely unrelated separate things, didn't make it into the podcast. And I guess when you're putting together a product, you have to decide, what is the mission and purpose of this product? Why are we doing it? And what do we want to achieve with it? And for us, the motivating factor from the very beginning was that the Cascio Tracks in and of themselves were a disgrace to Michael Jackson's artistic legacy. They were not him, so they shouldn't be part of his artistic legacy. The movement initially was to have the songs removed and to investigate how the songs came to be, and to answer the questions that we'd all had, and to answer them for the people who maybe hadn't even asked the question of how and why, but might be interested to know. Your product can be really focused on an investigation of authenticity. What is the true nature of what these songs are? And you can stay focused on that, and you can just prove your point and do it compellingly. And anyone who wants to come on that particular ride can come on that ride and go from total unknown to solving it at the end, and the songs come down and case closed. And I think including information like what you mentioned in that question would only sidetrack from the bigger issue. And I think what you're talking about is common in all fan communities, where there are powerful entities with something more important than artistic legacy and pleasing fans. Like, they have a financial motive to just, silence the dissent and whatever. It was part of our story in the sense that it affected Dan, because he was talking about his interactions with the MJ Online team, mine as well, and then collectively what had happened with the guys that ended up getting raided and arrested and charged by the British FBI, the Serious Organised Crime Agency. That was directly impacting us as the team that were investigating this. But those other things were kind of just like distractions, because the podcast gets written before it gets recorded. You don't just sit down at the microphone and start talking. You have to plan everything. And when you've got 13 episodes, you don't just plan the one episode you're working on. You've got to plan all of them in sequence and make sure it all kind of peels back layers like an onion. And you really want to get everything in order and everything to stay on topic to what your actual core mission is. Those things would have just been distractions. They probably would have lost us some of our audience as well, because it's kind of more like we have a really intellectual investigation of an art forgery and corporate fraud. And then you have fan community, online, mysterious alias politics and arguments and bitching and and like, who is this person? And like, that stuff just kind of diminishes the journalistic delivery of this art crime investigation. And this is the biggest, most sophisticated art crime of the 21st century, I would say. And you just got to focus on that and pick your battles and prove that, and not really worry about all this other stuff. There was some really specific detail with like names and real detail about what the Cascio family and their friends and family were doing to move against our investigation as well. Forget about the fan forums and whoever was, moderating discussions or whatever. We had way more information about way more important things that also didn't get included for the same reasons. It's just like, if we go into the real detail of everything we know, we're going to lose our listeners. We're going to end up having 38 episodes, and this podcast is going to end up kind of getting fizzled out because nobody's going to want to go through all of that. So yeah, you pick your battles, you write your script, you focus on your key issue, and you deliver the best you can for that. And the rest can be internet fodder on the forums. If people want to discuss that, they can go on the forums and discuss it. It's not for faking Michael.
Now, James, some of the conduct by the estate raises a kind of a philosophical question when you're talking about their failure to engage, their failure to retract the questionable statement that was issued, well, not questionable, the demonstrably largely false statement that was issued, the black ops that were going on in the fan community. There's an FBI art fraud investigator who's interviewed in the series, and he says that Sony and the estate technically are the victims in this case because they're the ones that were duped into buying the fake songs. So my sort of philosophical question for you is, to what extent can Sony and the estate reasonably be considered the victims, or have they at some point crossed a line which for you transformed them from victims to accomplices? And if so, at what point was that line crossed?
Well, for a long time, I believed that it probably is true that the estate and Sony are a victim on behalf of MJCast. But you mentioned the infamous Weitzman statement. First of all, two things. No disrespect to Weitzman. I understand he's a highly, highly esteemed attorney, but that was probably the most foolish move like ever. Almost everything in that statement is false. It was a very deliberate, in my opinion, attempt to deceive the purchasing, consuming public. So not a smart move, but I understand otherwise he's a genius. You could say mildly, maybe an act of persuasion, but in my opinion, just an act of deception. Literally almost everything in that statement is false. And without it, I'm not sure how much of Vera's case relies on it actually, but maybe a lot. It was basically the guidebook to our investigation. Weitzman said he talked to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. Well, we're going to talk to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And we found false, 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 false. Yeah, so they're not victims. They intended to deceive us, even if they too were deceived.
In the podcast, we proved that that line was crossed before the album had even come out. Perhaps upon purchasing the songs, they didn't realize that there was a problem. Maybe they didn't even look to see if there could potentially be a problem. And honestly, who in the hell would even expect that there would be a problem? Like, you're the estate of Michael Jackson. You're in collaboration with Sony Music. You're going to do an album of unreleased Michael Jackson songs. And people all over the place are coming out of the woodwork with their unreleased Michael Jackson songs. Paul Anka's got this box of tapes from 1980, and all of a sudden John McClane's trying to remove the music and remix it. You've got Rodney Jerkins having unreleased stuff from Invincible Sessions, and Dr. Freeze having unreleased stuff from Invincible Sessions, and then you've got producers like Alay Reid saying, well, I did something for Dangerous, like I've got this, and everyone's coming out of the woodwork. And Michael Jackson was notorious for the way he worked with different people at different times in different locations, and Eddie Cascio comes along and says, oh, I got a bunch of songs that I recorded with him as well. And it's like, okay, like he's just another person in the list of people who had songs with Michael Jackson. This is not something that probably required any level of skepticism in the outset. And certainly the fans didn't exercise any level of skepticism when we heard Eddie Cascio has unreleased songs with Michael Jackson, because we were just as excited to hear them as the estate probably was. The estate's rubbing their hands together saying, here's millions of dollars when we release all of these unreleased Cascio tracks. And the fans are saying, fuck yeah, like we're going to get all of these unreleased Michael Jackson tracks and we're going to be able to listen to them. So we all have our vested interests. Like, we want to hear it. They want to profit from it. Eddie Cascio wants to get rich by selling it to them. Everyone's happy until we hear it. And when we hear it, as the FBI agent and the forensic experts in the podcast say, we are acute listeners. We are people who have listened to this man's voice more than anybody in the world. And we listen differently than a Sony executive who's going, how many songs? How are the vocals? How much money? Let's do the deal. We're listening to it from the perspective of Michael's legacy and whether the art matches his standards and whether we enjoy it or not. And when we put it on and we hear someone else's voice, immediately it's game over for us. That's not acceptable. But they weren't listening like that. They weren't listening with any level of skepticism or any level of scrutiny. And they probably weren't, even if they did think it was dodgy or shit, it was complete and they could put it out and they were going to make money from it. So for them, who really cares? The thing was that as soon as the people who knew, Jackson family, producers, fans, as soon as we heard it and we raised the alarm, and everyone raised the alarm almost immediately, those songs get delivered to Teddy Riley and Terrell Jackson, and within a week, they're saying there's something wrong here. Then we get the songs and we've already pre-exposed to the fact that there's going to be something wrong with them, and we obviously identify the same thing. At that point, when everybody is saying there's a problem and the estate is still saying, no, there's no problem, then they've crossed the line because they've got red flags coming everywhere. It's like if you call the fire brigade and say, my neighbor's house is on fire, and the fire brigade's too lazy or too interested in doing something else to care, and they look out the window and they, oh, yeah, I can see that house down the road. It is on fire, but no, it's not on fire. It's not on fire. Everyone's saying the house is on fire, and the police department's saying, nope, nothing to worry about here. And then the house burns down to the ground. That's what the estate has done here. They've had all these people telling them the house is on fire, and they just let it burn to the ground. That was before the album had come out. Like, this was a kind of dead in the water situation before the album had even come out. And then as the evidence unfolded, which what we discovered, and then which got put in Vera's hands with her lawsuit, it eventually came to the point where they did not have to have this lawsuit. They did not have to have this big fight. They could have just done what we'd asked. We had the evidence from the outset, and they still didn't do anything. They still just dug their heels in, pride, ego, hubris to the max, and they crossed the line and then crossed it again and crossed it even further and dug their heels in. And in the end, they ended up doing what we asked from the outset anyway, removing the fucking songs. So the line was crossed multiple times by the estate, even though they did start as the victims.
I think largely for them, they wanted to just draw a line of authority somewhere. I think they were facing lots of challenges in many areas. There's the Murray trial going on. There's the Jackson family versus the estate, the various finances, paying off Michael's debt or whatever they're working on, all the deals they're working on. They had to be able to wedge power to manifest those moves in their favor. And they saw us fans as just an easy group to just kind of draw that line of authority. And to this day, we haven't received a proper apology. You know what I mean? The partnership artistically between the fans and the estate was just severed so badly. Like we no longer trust them creatively, and they refuse to give up that authority. I think that's why the products have been so kind of poor pretty much the whole time. It's just because there just is no creative partnership, and it stems from this moment. This Is It was a creative partnership. I mean, there's people on this very call who promoted it and supported it and, backed it. That partnership was forever severed. I wish Faking Michael would get the traction it deserves, because this is a tale that should be told in every entertainment business class and every business class just generally. I mean, we live in a social, crowdsourced world, and these old school guys really, really botched this big business moment, probably to the tune of billions of dollars. I think we could all accept that the Michael album was not a commercial success. I think we can all accept that Escape was not the success to Michael's level we think it should be. They botched it creatively. They totally botched it. And they've never owned up to it. Never owned up to it.
Now, Damien, I checked the Apple Podcasts app earlier today, and you have a full 5-star rating. I think you have universal 5-star reviews on the podcast, but there was a smattering of trolling that you received when the series came out from kind of pro-estate and pro-Cascio bots, potentially, whoever they were. And one of the criticisms that was made under a lot of your posts was that, why has Eddie Cascio's viewpoint only been given 20 seconds in the entire series, which of course is not true anyway. But I just want to be clear, how many times do you estimate between 2010 and 2024 that you and your team offered Eddie Cascio either the opportunity to sit down for an interview or the opportunity to issue some kind of statement or comment?
I do not have the number in front of me. I've never even thought to try and collate the number of outreach that would have been done in totality. The person who had the most outreach to Eddie would have been Jamon. The problem is with me personally, having been so loud and out there about wanting to, bring this particular story to justice, is that if you attach the name Damien Shields to this, you're automatically going to get a big group of people who are just going to say, I'm not going to talk to that person. And Jamon encountered this even when he was speaking to people like Frank Cascio. Jamon was having a nice conversation with Frank Cascio at one point, and then Frank Cascio must have gone on Jamon's Facebook or Instagram or something and realized that he was friends with me. And all of a sudden, the conversation turned to, you're friends with Damien Shields. I'm not friends with Damien Shields. He's a mean and jealous man. He's a con. I don't want to. And then that's where the conversation between Jamon and Frank comes to a complete end. And so my name being associated with those conversations burned bridges really quickly, because people were just like, this is too hot of a topic. This is a person who's not on our side. We don't want to talk to him. We don't want to associate with it. So me personally, other than I think 2010 or early 2011, when we were learning about the Copyright Office and finding that, okay, people have listed their email addresses and their phone numbers on there, you outreach, you say, hey, I want to talk to you about this, and you don't get any response, and then you send a follow-up email and you realize your email's been blocked. You're getting a rejection back. And then at some point in 2014, when Vera sued them, she sued not only the estate, Sony, but also Eddie Cascio and James Porte individually and their production company, Angelica Productions. She sued them for fraud. At that point, they purged their emails. So you can't even get them. You can't contact them at that point unless you manage to, like Jamon did, find an alternate version of their contact details that somehow linked to a Facebook something and you want to do a video call. But by that point, like by 2014, 4 years removed from the actual crime, nobody is talking to Damien Shields. So Jamon really took a lot of that initiative to try and send the emails, make the calls, try and have the conversations. And he was very successful with it, considering what we were dealing with, considering the situation we were in. What he was able to pull off in speaking to these people was quite unbelievable. And James as well. James also had several attempts to contact these people and had some degree of success in connecting with them. But as you hear in the podcast, like once he got connected, it was a bit of a circus. For me personally, I don't know. It wouldn't have been all that much outreach from me personally, but the team who's, working collectively with me and reporting back to me, there's a significant amount of outreach. Not overwhelming outreach, because you have to be ethical in the sense that you're not allowed to stalk or harass anybody, but you have to give them the opportunity to answer what you've learned and tell their side of the story. And we did tell their side of the story, even though they were not willing participants in the story. We still told their side of the story. We still spent an entire 2 episodes detailing and chronicling their relationship with Michael and the people around him and the so-called work. And I think we did a very good job of being fair to people that we felt were federal criminals. I'm very proud of the way we presented the story about them, even though we weren't able to get their willing participation in the actual podcast.
I agree. I think the criticisms that were made by those trolls/bots were not rooted in facts, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to respond.
There was a lot of outreach, not just to Eddie Cascio, but to other folks who were involved in the fraud. So I was always very passionate primarily about speaking to people who were complicit or involved with Eddie. Folks like Stuart Brawley, Teddy Riley, who came on board later, legitimizing the song, sort of attempting to. Jason Capetta, we haven't spoken about him much yet in the conversation today. I spoke to all of these people at different times in different ways. Some of them on Twitter through DM, some of them through FaceTime. Jason, I spoke to a number of times, mainly through calling his place of work. And I can't remember, Damien, if this particular call that made it into Faking Michael. I can't remember, but I do remember one time when I called Jason at his office. And I used to have to do this at a ridiculous time, usually like in the middle of the night, like 2 a.m. or something, to get him. You'd get onto him and he'd talk to you and you would know it was him because his voice is so recognizable. It sounds exactly like him. But he would
you call him on the number that he has listed at the US Copyright Office with all of his music. It's like, it's his number.
And he'd pretend it's not him. And it's just, where does the conversation go after that? If you're talking to him saying, I know it's you, I can hear it's you. Can we talk about this, please? And here comes this voice back at you that you know is Jason Capetta, and he's saying, I don't know who that is. Like, just absurd situations like that would happen.
The funniest was when you call him at work, and then the receptionist that answers, you say, is Deputy Capetta there? Yeah, I'll put you through. And then he answers and he says it's not him. Like, literally, this is your place of work. We've just asked the receptionist for you. She has just put us through to you. And your voice is coming back denying that it's you. You're a law enforcement officer lying down the phone. You're a public servant lying down the phone to a person who has called to speak to you about it, you even being you. Like, what kind of deputy sheriff are you?
Yeah, yeah. And I think one thing I'd like to point out is that when you speak to people who legitimately worked with Michael and are proud of their work with Michael and have nothing to hide, they often are very liberal with their stories and information, and they want to talk about it. It's never that big a deal when you reach out to an engineer or somebody like that. They usually want to talk to you about their work with Michael. But anybody that was connected to these songs, particularly as you look through the liner notes of the Michael album, and, we were methodically reaching out to all of the people listed in those notes. If anybody was connected to these tracks and felt like they had something to hide, automatically a wall would go up. I can't tell you how many people I spoke to on Twitter through DM that had worked with Michael, but had also worked on these songs, and they just did not want to talk. And yeah, maybe it was a non-disclosure type situation. I don't think so, because a lot of other folks that legitimately worked with Michael who also signed NDs would still want to talk about their general work with him, but it was almost like anyone connected to the Cascio Tracks, a wall went up and they just didn't want to give information. So speaking with a lot of these quote-unquote bad guys, people who were sort of complicit in the construction of these songs, was a very frustrating process, because often they just did not want to talk. Teddy Riley was somebody who was like that. He was very hot and cold. One moment he'd say he'd want to talk to you, the next minute he'd say he didn't want to talk to you. There were times I felt we were pretty close to being able to secure interviews with him, but he was a very, very unpredictable person. Over the course of our sporadic conversations, he slowly started to open up around being taken advantage of. I think he used to kind of frame it as. Let's see where he goes when his book comes out. I think it's early next year. We'll see what he's got to say on the topic, if anything at all. But
I should say, Jamon, that you should be congratulated, not to blow smoke up your ass, but there was many moments where I thought we'd exhausted certain avenues, and I thought, well, we're just not going to get that person to talk. They just don't want to. And months and months would pass, sometimes even years would pass, and I didn't even realize that you'd been behind the scenes just like actively reaching out and contacting people and doing things, and you'd come to me and you go, I've got this person on the phone right now, or like, I'm actively talking to this person in an instant chat right now. What do we need to ask them? Like, you've got them on the side and me on the phone, and like, oh, far out, he's still working on this. He's still actively digging and trying to get more information about this. And it was the relentlessness that was just, I just thought it was amazing every time you would contact me with something like this, because I honestly thought like we'd given up on that. that was a dead end, but it wasn't to you. And because of that, like, there was some really detailed. I remember one time you got Jason Malachi on instant message and you were just going back and forth with him. And I was like, holy shit. And he's like really, really having a conversation with you. And, out of nowhere, just like, you're just like a Saturday morning, just like, I'm going to get on there and just like try and talk to Jason today. And then all of a sudden you're in a conversation with Jason. Like, it's crazy. And the same thing with the Eddie Cascio thing, which Charlie said he's going to come back to. But I'll never forget the day that you called me and you were like, I've got Eddie Cascio on the phone right now. It was crazy.
Yeah, I thank you for saying that. I think even speaking to some of the people around these individuals, like I've spoken to Jason Capetta's kids. At the time, they weren't kids. They had become adults, but his children. I've spoken to family members of, there was one particular engineer who worked with Eddie Cascio just prior to the album coming out, and he died in a freak accident, and I spoke to his family members, and there's a lot of people we had to talk to, but there was always this kind of shroud of darkness around the situation. It was very difficult to get information.
Yeah, and back to the point that we made about like the online trolls and who we didn't really give much attention to in the podcast. We had to make some of those same decisions with these people because, you know, we're making a story that's a public interest story, but you know, if you manage to have a chance conversation with somebody's children, it's not necessary to say that in a podcast, like, or to put the content of the conversation in the podcast. Oftentimes, you do manage to get a hold of people. You do manage to talk to people, and you realize, oh, these are just nice, everyday people. They're not involved with this. They shouldn't be held accountable, and they probably don't know anything. And so, even though you've spoken to maybe 100 people, maybe only 30 of them have given you something that's actually A, in the public interest, and B, adds to the actual narrative of the story you're trying to tell with the thing. And so, yeah, we did a lot more work than anyone would ever know, but it didn't always render a result that was journalistically and ethically worthy of being included, but we still did the work. Like you have to look down every hole to find out if there's something in there.
I just want to say a couple things real quick. One, for those of you listening who have not heard the entirety of Faking Michael, it is Jason. We have the conclusion. I don't know if we can say conclusion, but we have the confession. We don't necessarily have to go into those details on this podcast. It's in Faking Michael. It is Jason, which makes sense. That's why he's not talking to us. The official narrative is that Jason has nothing to do with it. So he's as free to talk about it as you and I and anybody else you see on the street. The only official connection officially is a phone call he had with the estate asking him if it was him. Officially, that is the only connection between Jason Capetta in the official narrative and the estate. Yet this guy refuses to talk, has never publicly denied it, even to close friends, won't confirm or deny, and in legal proceedings, confesses it. So it is Jason. It's not a mystery. It explains why he's not talking. We all try to be pretty empathetic. These are all very relatable characters. They're all our age. They're all fans. They come from our world. Jason is a guy who's caught up in some deep doo-doo. I think he has a public life that's supposed to carry a lot of honor and integrity. We can relate with, well, I can't say we can relate with the situation, but we look forward to hearing your story, however you want to tell it. And I hope we do get to hear it. And I hope it's through Faking Michael, or the MJCast would be a beautiful platform for it. I'm sure you've got very interesting things to say. That's all I wanted to say.
Now, Jamon, we touched earlier on the Eddie Cascio call, the fabled Eddie Cascio call. Jamon, you're going to just run through the interview about quite a broad range of subjects.
Sure. Well, we spoke for about 1 hour and 15 minutes or 1 hour and 17 minutes, somewhere around that time frame. And we spoke about a great many things, including Eddie's work with Michael Jackson, according to Eddie, and also the media and the molestation trial in the mid-2000s and quite a range of things. But in terms of working with Michael, he talked about working on choreography every single day, dancing at least an hour a day and barely sleeping. Eddie claimed that they would put in like a full day of work until about 3 a.m. in the morning, until it was time for Eddie to go upstairs to bed because Michael was sleeping in the basement. And Eddie would go upstairs to brush his teeth, and then Michael would call him and say, "Hey, I've got a Red Bull ready to go. Come back down. Let's keep working." Eddie talked about them both conceptualizing This Is It together. And during the mid-2000s trial, a lot of what got Michael through it, according to Eddie, was Eddie being in the studio working and Michael calling him to check in on how things were going with certain songs. Eddie had a memory, I think, of watching a Lakers game at a friend's house during the trial era, and Michael called him during that particular time and requested that he go back to the studio, and within 15 minutes, Eddie was in a studio continuing to work on music. And I think their working relationship, according to Eddie at that time, was very much like Eddie in a studio and Michael remotely calling in via phone to talk about the tracks. From memory, Eddie also talked quite a bit about the media He talked about everybody becoming selfish and intrigued by media bullcrap and people so easily believing rubbish stories and not putting effort into understanding who the media really is, meaning a system used by people to become famous that would turn on them pretty quickly. We also talked about the molestation trial and how painful it was for Eddie to watch Michael hurting during that time. He said that he understood what Michael was feeling during those times, including in 1993. Remember, he was essentially a child that was on tour with Michael during the Dangerous tour, during portions of it. And he described it as taking the brunt with Michael. People would say he was molested by Michael Jackson, and he considered that to be bullying when he was a child. And of course, we also talked about Wade Robson pretty directly. It frustrated Eddie, I think, to think that somebody like Wade, someone who Michael did so much for, would turn on him in the way that he did. He described the allegations as silly. He said he spent a lot of time with Michael, staying in the same room as him, the same bed as him, and I remember him saying the word nothing. He told me that if anybody needed to speak with him, he'd have no problem speaking up because he believed in Michael's legacy, and Michael should be remembered for the greatness of his heart, not fabricated lies. He also talked about Michael's kids. I believe he was pretty close friends with particularly Paris and Prince for a long period of time. And he said that Michael's kids didn't deserve their father being ridiculed even when he's not here. And he said he knows Wade. And from memory, he talked about knowing Wade and was frustrated by Wade saying the things he was saying.
Wow. So, Jamon, what actually did happen next? Did he just ghost you, or why did the episode never happen?
So there's different theories about this.
It's got to be the text message.
We're not mentioning the text message
that you were mentioning.
Okay. So
he sent him a text.
A few things happened.
Supposed to go to me.
A few things happened. So in the call, at the end of the call, I made the decision to mention that I knew Damien because, and I know that might be considered pretty dumb to do, but I thought it's just going to be a matter of time. It'll be minutes, it'll be hours before he looks up online and sees that I'm close friends with Damien. And I thought I just need to air all the dirty laundry with this guy right now, because if I don't, he's just going to find this out and ghost me. So that was one thing that happened. The second thing that would happen was we had subsequent phone calls after that one. I remember calling him when he was at a dinner party at one point, and I could tell he was saying, yeah, we'll still do the episode. I really want to do it. But even though he kept saying we were going to do the episode, he just didn't ever lock in a time with me, and it just never went anywhere. And then eventually he stopped talking to me. And yes, there was one time where
the final straw.
The final straw
because it was
that I accidentally
the
texted him a message that was intended for Damien, and it was nothing to do with Michael Jackson. It was nothing to do with the podcast. It was some kind of joke.
It would have been a ridiculous text message.
It would have the things we text each other. Oh my God! But it went to Eddie, and that was the end. So
I think because on your iMessage, like he and I were the two most recent conversation windows, and instead of flicking back from the Eddie one to me and sending it, you typed it straight to him and sent it.
Yep. Anyway, let's move on.
Okay, so when the questions were first being raised about the legitimacy of the songs, there were a series of explanations that started to trickle out. Michael's vocal just sounds strange because it was sung through a PVC pipe. Michael's vocal sounds strange because he sang it in a shower. The vocal sounds strange because we used Melodyne on it. I can't really quite remember how those claims trickled out, whether it was all through Roger Friedman or somewhere else. And I don't remember them being explored particularly during the podcast. So, Damien, can you refresh our memory as to where that sequence of claims came from? And why did you decide not to particularly focus on them in the series? Because they do seem quite ridiculous and to paint the Cassios in a light that makes them maybe not people that you would necessarily believe.
Okay, so here's the thing about some of these claims. Eddie Cascio and James Porte are obviously students of Michael Jackson. They're not just some random people who don't know too much about Michael Jackson who tried to make fake Michael Jackson songs. These are people who actually, they know what they're talking about when it comes to Michael Jackson, it comes to his art, his creative process and whatever. And I mean, Bruce Swedian's book, Bruce Swedian is the most prolific audio recording engineer and mixing engineer that worked with Michael Jackson throughout his whole career. He came to work with Michael Jackson through Michael Jackson's collaboration with Quincy Jones. And Bruce published a book in which he talks about some of the interesting techniques that they used when working on different various things. And he recalls at one point recording a background vocal through a cardboard mailing tube, basically the exact same form as a PVC pipe. And so Eddie Cascio disclosed to the estate and Sony when they were kind of having chit chat about like what cool information can we put in the liner notes and in the book and like what's some background about this song. And Eddie decided to say that some of the background vocals on one of the songs was recorded through a PVC pipe. And it has to be because they knew that Michael had done that before. Like that is something he had done before. Same thing with the shower stuff. Like the way that Eddie describes it about like Michael like sitting on a bench inside the shower and like like it's not how Michael would do it, but he knew that Michael had recorded vocals in bathrooms. If you talk to any of Michael's recording engineers who actually did work with him, Michael liked the natural reverb and the acoustics of the bathroom for certain types of vocal stylings. And he really did record vocals in bathrooms. Like the vocal for Best of Joy, which sounds nothing like the Cascio Tracks, I might add, was recorded in the bathroom at the Bel Air Hotel in Los Angeles. So Michael really did do these things. But it's just like little pieces of what was true for Michael in certain moments of his life. Well, let's just say he did that here, and then we'll attribute to the oddities to these types of things. And the Melodyne was an excuse that the Cassios had given privately in negotiations with the estate and Sony and people who were questioning them about like, you know, what's all these issues with the songs and how can we explain all of this? And Teddy Riley had got wind of the fact that they had claimed that they had used Melodyne, or at some point Teddy just started calling it processing. The Melodyning and the processing. And he started talking about it in interviews. Like this is like a behind the scenes, I'm giving this excuse to legal people and record executives to try and shut them up about why our songs sound wrong. And Teddy gets wind of it and he just goes out and does podcasts and radio interviews. And he's like, oh, it's the processing and it's the this and it's the that. And all of these things collectively find their way into the public consciousness one way or the other. The shower thing came in a Sony Music documentary that was made about the making of the Michael album that was released very fleetingly and then unreleased. Like they removed it from the YouTube channel that they initially released it on. But in that one, that's where Eddie's like taking a video camera down to his basement and like opening the shower door and he's like going inside the shower and he's like, yeah, we had a little bench here and Michael would sit at the bench and record his background vocals at this bench. And then the guy, the interviewer was like, and presumably he would like also shower here. And then Eddie was like, yeah. And he would shower here. And that's where all these things come from. Like there's just tidbits, little tiny things that have been thrown out into the ether. And the people that, you know, want to argue that the songs are real, they put those things together and say, well, look at all these little things. This explains everything. It's the shower and the PVC pipe and the Melodyne. That's why Michael Jackson sounds exactly like Jason Malachi. That's the reason.
Yeah, I suppose the key thing is Michael may have done these things in the past, but somehow he still sounded like Michael Jackson when he did them, you know. So to venture it as an excuse for not sounding like Michael Jackson does not really make any sense.
Yeah.
James, let me ask you this. In 14 years of investigation, did you or any of the team ever find a single person who was central in Michael's life between 2007 and 2009 who remembered him ever telling them anything about having recorded a bunch of songs in Eddie Cascio's basement.
No, not at all. Not only that, but we have handwritten. Michael was obsessed with songs and song titles in this era. He was definitely working on new material and a new album. And song titles were everywhere on whiteboards, on notes, on CDRs, on discs he had around his bedroom. You don't find any of these titles. And the ones you do find are Water and Monster. And we already know those are legitimate songs that he was working on with collaborators like Michael Prince and others. There is one, it's in Faking Michael. He did have in his possession a CDR that had, I believe, Ready to Win on it. Another track too, Damien or Dan, if you guys recall?
There were two.
Was it Ready to Win?
Two.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, it had Ready to Win on it.
Yeah, one of them was Ready to Win. The other one was something else.
So it does show that James Porte and Eddie Cascio were working on stuff for Michael and presenting stuff for Michael in that time period. And that's not something any of us are disputing. I mean, it's, again, for those of you who don't know, we don't deny that they weren't writing for Michael. We don't deny that. I mean, I think Michael had very limited awareness about the tracks. That's your core question here, Charlie. Very limited. The only thing we can prove in evidence is literally that CDR with those two tracks. Even in the copyright record, I mean, it seemed like James Porte and Eddie Cascio were almost trying to protect themselves from Michael gobbling up credit for the songs, if you want me to be honest. It was only after Michael had died and a Michael credit became very lucrative that all of a sudden they were co-written by Michael, in my opinion. I mean, there's no other way you can look at the timeline of evidence. So no, Michael did not, in my opinion, Michael did not co-write these songs whatsoever. And we certainly don't believe Michael Jackson sang these songs whatsoever. And as far as we can prove, I don't think Michael even knew most of these titles. He's never written them. And some titles like Hollywood Tonight, some titles he would write over and over and over again. I mean, he had songs on his mind all the time, but not these songs. Not these songs.
Yeah. And just to add to that quickly, we were very serious about speaking to people that were hanging around Michael Jackson at the time that Michael was staying with the Cascios in 2007. So Elise Capron, host of the MJCast, she spoke to the kid's teacher, Eileen Medalla, who was around at that time. Damien, you and I together interviewed Bill Whitfield, who was around at that time. And there was no substantiating evidence that Michael was spending a lot of time recording in that basement.
Yeah, I mean, Bill Whitfield said that he had heard music coming from the studio, but he hadn't been able to identify what the music was. That's the same time period in which Michael was doing the Thriller 25 project. So, I mean, there are other explanations as to why music might be coming from a studio. And also, a studio is a place you make music. So, of course, music could be coming from there. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the songs that sound like Jason Malachi that's coming from there. But yeah, there were little tidbits of things where people had said, like, I was aware that he was spending time. I heard his conversations with Eddie, but nobody. And we really tried to find, like James said, like that CD where there's discs with these titles, 2 Cascio track titles. That was the absolute best and strongest evidence that we could find that Michael may have even been aware of any of these songs. And obviously, like those particular CDs, different to a lot of the other CDs that we found, were not written in Michael Jackson's handwriting. So like there would be discs where Michael himself would write stuff on things, and then there would be things that other people had created and given to him, which would have their handwriting on it. And we've got the 2 Cascio titles. It doesn't even have Michael's handwriting on it. It's somebody else's. So it's something that's obviously been made and given to him to listen to, but not something that he has made himself. So and we were open to, finding things that we didn't expect to find. And I mean, that's why we spent days and days and days at the US Copyright Office, like spending thousands and thousands of dollars to literally listen to every single song that James Porte and Eddie Cascio had ever made, had ever copyrighted. And, we were looking for evidence that these songs could have been somehow connected to Michael Jackson. It's the only purpose to do that research. And it was all fruitless, completely fruitless.
I suppose the point I'm getting at is Michael was working on music around that time, and he was working in collaboration with people that he had been working with for over a decade, people like Michael Prince, who were essentially managing the process of Michael beginning to get back to music and kind of figure out what his next project was going to be, whether it was going to be an album, whether it was going to be a series of singles. And these were people that were in charge of archiving all his work, and they knew exactly what he was working on and what his plans were. And none of these people who were actively involved in Michael's recording of music around this period, he never mentioned to any of them, oh, by the way, I've recorded a bunch of songs with the Cassios.
No, and to that point, you mentioned Michael Prince, so this is a great example. There are songs that Michael worked on, and this is common with a lot of songs that Michael worked on. They would find their way into the hands of multiple collaborators. He wasn't just like interested in hearing what one person thought of something. He would literally take it to someone else, work on it more. Things would evolve over time through the contributions of multiple different people. One example is the song Changes. It's an unreleased song. It's just a demo. It's just with a scratch vocal. It started in the mid-'80s with John Barnes at Havenhurst, Michael's old home studio when he lived in Encino. And he did this demo, and it didn't go anywhere. And then in the history sessions, he brought it back out and worked on it with Brad Buxer. And the Andre Crouch choir was added, and it became a little bit more complete, but still completely incomplete. And it got notations were made on the Pro Tools session about what they'd done and how Michael felt about it. And then it was kind of shelved again. And then over time, those files got migrated onto a hard drive with Michael Prince, who wasn't working with Michael during the history sessions, but then who started working with Michael in the studio at the end of the history tour. So like the beginning of 1998, basically. And he gets copies of all of these incomplete songs that had been works in progress over the years. Starts with John Barnes, goes to Brad Buxer, Andre Crouch choir contributes, and now it's in Michael Prince's hands, and he's got a copy of it. And you can see the history. You can see the documented history. And these songs are going through multiple people's hands. And someone like Michael Prince, who pretty much everything ended up with him, he never heard of any of these things. And he knew Eddie Cascio. He knew the Cascio family. And he never heard of these songs before. And that would be odd for someone who was so integral in the work of Michael Jackson, like you said, like archiving and just making sure we have a record of where things are and what stage they're at, that he would not have at least heard of anything. Because if Michael liked the song, he would want to be listening to it. He would want to be contributing towards it, making tweaks. Like he would tweak things that you and I wouldn't even bother tweaking. But, he would want to change the decibels of the drums in the background that no one even knows is there. And he'd be constantly working on stuff. And he needed people like Michael Prince to do that because he wasn't tech savvy enough to do it himself. And yeah, like nobody had ever heard of these songs. Nobody. Karen Langford was calling all over the place. She was calling everybody to try and say, do you know anything about these songs? She even called Joe Vogel about it. Do you know anything about these songs? We're trying to find out about these songs. And Joe Vogel even said he contacted some of his sources, Brad Buxer, Matt Forger, whoever he was in contact with, and no one had heard of them. Nobody. So it wasn't just who we could find, who we could talk to, who could tell us whether they were familiar with them. It was who other journalists and estate people and whoever. Nobody could ever find somebody who had ever heard of these songs before.
Yeah, I have to say that does strike me, to be honest, as one of the most compelling pieces of information in the entire podcast, is that the idea that Michael, who was actively working on new music with a group of people, a team of people, would just forget or fail to tell his closest collaborators about these 12 songs that he's recorded. It just doesn't make any sense at all. Dan, you were in a very privileged position because you were editing these episodes together. So you were hearing Faking Michael before anybody in the world was hearing Faking Michael as you were making it. As it unfolded, what to you was the most powerful piece of evidence that you heard? What was What was the thing that when it came into your ears, you were just like, what?
Man, where do I start? Yeah, I mean, I've been on this journey for almost with Damien since the beginning, because Damien and I have been good friends, and so I've been privy to a lot of the investigation on the behind the scenes. But I guess, yeah, I mean, well, speaking about those those photos of the CD of whatever, All Ready to Win, that was on the disc that Michael had in his possession at Carrollwood. That was something that came almost at the last minute, kind of came in very late, so we had to put that in. That was a very interesting moment, kind of going through those photos and connecting some dots. Lawanda's testimony was absolutely bombshell for me. I think I even said to Damien, like, don't tell me what you talked about too much. Like, don't even tell me. Because, what Damien would do, he would speak to somebody, and then he might even tell me straight away what happened, or he'll go away and he'll then sift through the whole thing and then cull it down to the bare bones of what he wants to use in the podcast. And then he might send it to me. But I said to him, like, don't send it to me ahead of time. I don't want to listen to it because it's getting so good. Like, I just want to experience it as a fan, as a listener. So yeah, there were multiple times where I listened to things for the first time without having seen the script. But Lawanda's testimony was crazy. The amount of detail that she went into, with the logs and the emails and the timeline and how that went back and forth and fit perfectly with how Michael Prince was describing his experience. I think that for me was solid. It's probably, I mean, God, there's so many things to talk about. The testimony from Joe Bennett, which I was privy to because I was part of that call, but also from Dr. Papson. I think that was one of the most interesting pieces of evidence and testimony for me, for sure.
And Tony Curtis.
Well, but Tony Curtis came out from the beginning, so I was kind of like, I already knew where he was coming from his YouTube comments back in the day. But yeah.
The thing with Tony Curtis is he came out the gate before anybody really knew what had actually gone on. And it's easy to kind of speak your mind when you don't think there's anything on the line, really. Like, it's not that serious or whatever.
Mm.
But when he actually really opened up and told me everything that had happened, at that point, there was lawsuits. There was, Jason was being dragged into it, and he was at that point. You could easily understand why he would say, "Look, I don't want to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it." That was like a shock to me that he actually wanted to tell me about that stuff at that exact moment when he told me about it, because it was so many years later. I'd spent over a decade trying to get Tony Curtis to talk to me on the record, and he just never responded or never wanted to or never did.
Mm.
And then for it to happen at the time that it had happened was the most shocking thing to me, because you could have just said, "Look, I've made comments about it on YouTube and Twitter and whatever," and just use that. But he didn't. He went further, and some of the stuff that he said was just wild.
Yeah, obviously the confession from Jason as well that we have in the podcast, that was also a big moment.
I was just about to ask you, Dan, how long before that episode came out did you first hear about the confession?
Good question. I don't know.
Hear about it or hear it?
Both.
We had known that Jason had confessed
months
the day he had to Vera.
Oh.
No, in 2018, when the lawsuit was kind of at its most active. It was being reported on in the media, and there was, it was really, really in the courts. It was a back and forth, and Jason had actually got the lawyers to reach out to Vera's team and to the estate, and he was like, I want to resolve this. I want to admit that it's me, and I want to end the whole thing. And he didn't want to be dragged into it. That's what he was trying to avoid. Was the next logical step for Vera was to add him to the lawsuit as a fraud defendant, because all the evidence that we had kind of proved that it was him already, and he realized that. So he made that confession all that time back, and then the confession that you hear in the podcast is actually him just retelling about the original confession. So he's kind of confessing again, but he's actually
in third person.
Yeah, he's third person telling it, because he's telling about how he originally confessed and then what threats he received after he tried to do that. So that confession it came into the picture at the last minute, the audio of it, but we'd known about it for 6 years before that. So it was kind of like, holy fucking shit. Here is Jason talking about that thing that we've known about for 6 years, but he's telling it in his own voice. That's out of control.
Yeah, it must have been several weeks or several months tops before that episode came out. We were like several weeks ahead of everybody else.
Now, the clip that you use of the confession is very, very short. How much are you able to say about the provenance of the confession and why you used such a tiny clip of it?
So it's limited in its use because it is limited in what we have access to. So that audio comes from a much longer conversation. It was provided to us by the person who recorded it. However, all of the audio is not in the public interest. And so it's an interesting kind of balance you have to draw when you're using an audio that you didn't record, that perhaps wasn't recorded with explicit like, hey, do you want to come on my podcast? Yeah, I'd love to come on the podcast. Here, let's do it. Let's record it. And it's all captured like that. Investigative journalism doesn't always work like that. And sometimes you end up capturing, like, for example, with Lawanda, that was on the record, but it was a 4.5 hour conversation. And I would say 3.5 hours of it was completely unusable because it wasn't in the public interest. It wasn't about the specific thing that we were investigating. She would get off topic all the time. And she'd be talking personal details, talking about other people, maybe disparaging people or things that could be taken as libelous or slanderous because she's having a private conversation. She doesn't expect it to be broadcast. And ethically, as a journalist, you make the choice, well, I'm obviously not going to broadcast any of the things that don't connect directly to the story. And so with the Jason confession thing, we were given what was relevant to that particular subject of him confessing, but the entire audio would have exposed who he was talking to, and that person doesn't want that to be disclosed. And he was telling private details of his life that aren't necessarily related to the fact that he confessed to this and the threats that he claims to have received from the estate and Sony as a result of trying to do that. And so everybody's kind of trying to do the right thing by, we don't have the full 2-hour conversation that he had. We have this excerpt. And then we have even used a smaller portion of the excerpt in here to only give what we're trying to do. It's demonstrative use. And so we're making a claim that he made the confession, and then we're supporting the fact that he did by him telling that he did. But beyond that, I mean, it's very difficult to just say, hey, we're going to put everything in here. It's the same thing with Eddie. It's like, what was directly relevant to the authenticity of the songs? Well, it's not that much. So we're just going to use what's relevant. And just the choices you have to make. You can't include everything. You can't have a 200-hour podcast, and you can't be exposing people's personal lives and the things that are not in the public interest in this particular forum. It's just not the way to do it.
We've talked a few times about the US Copyright Office. So your investigation takes you and James to Washington to the US Copyright Office. There you uncover some extremely damning information. A brief recap would be, for example, songs that were registered in 2009 as having supposedly been written by Michael Jackson in 2007 had previously been identically registered without Michael Jackson's name on them prior to 2007. Metadata on some of the songs showed they'd been worked on, in some cases literally days before they were registered with the Copyright Office in 2009, and yet they had no Michael Jackson vocals on them, which is inexplicable if he supposedly recorded them in 2007. But one thing that you don't really talk about much in the podcast is you also, while you were there, pulled a bunch of Michael stuff that nobody's ever heard and listened to that because you were looking for, is there something in these songs that nobody's heard which could maybe tell us something that might connect him in some way to the Cascio songs? Maybe an unreleased Michael Jackson song that was registered years earlier will turn out to have the same melody or something. But so while you were pulling all of this Michael Jackson stuff that's never been heard, that's something that's very interesting for fans, but of course does not directly drive the narrative of your series. So I just wondered, while you're here on the MJCast, James, what would you say were like maybe the 3 most interesting Michael Jackson things that you ended up listening to at the Copyright Office?
First of all, pretty much everything we pulled was very relatable to these Cascio songs. So, I mean, the first thing we heard was Monster and Water, because those were registered separately from all the songbooks Angelicson had registered. I think they've already leaked, or snippets have leaked. I mean, we're talking literally 12 years later now. That's where we had first heard those two songs, and they sound amazing. I think only snippets have leaked, so I guess maybe some fans haven't heard the full songs. I mean, from what I remember, they're just incredible. They're amazing songs. And just to hear his voice, his real, especially, I mean, hearing James Porte's voice, that's, first of all, in the copyright record, the only voice that's there in all those registries is James Porte's voice on those songs, up until they sell them to Sony and the estate. So the songs are registered multiple times. And James Porte is was a very budding and prolific, seems like a pretty cool guy from like 2000 to 2009. Like he was, writing songs for artists like Brandy. He had his Bobby Ewing R&B career, writing songs for Michael Jackson. Those are all things we can prove and paint about this character from the copyright record. We're probably the world's foremost experts on James Porte's work, actually. And I mean, that consumed days and days and days. And then all of a sudden you hear that angelic, after all those not Michael songs, you hear that, absolute angel on Water or Monster, the real Water and the real Monster. It's just, they're magical. They're magical songs. And for that reason will forever be magical songs. And by the way, totally different from the Cascio songs, totally unrelated and interesting. Like if we ever get the real story, why are there two Waters and why are there two Monsters? How did James and Eddie know about Water and Monster? And what inspired them to write their version of Water and Monster? Did Michael task two different teams with writing songs around these titles or these themes? What's going on there? Songs like Black Widow, that are in the copyright record, and Michael thematically choosing to use Black Widow spiders, and This Is It. There's some cool little connections that, we can't fully unpack, but we can certainly detect, and we detected those from the Copyright Office. So that kind of stuff's really exciting. The real Water and the real Monster, just incredible.
Didn't you guys also pull things like the original 1970s recording of Little Susie, for example, things like that?
Yeah. Since we were there in the theater, we decided to get a couple of things. Yeah, that was one of the things, which is, for those who are unaware, Little Susie was written according to the copyright record in 1978. A recording of it was registered at the Copyright Office. The original tape that was made in 1978, like literally has handwriting on it saying Susie 1978 on the side of the tape. It's practically identical to exactly how Michael released it on the History album. Literally the same song. Nothing really different about it at all, which was pretty crazy to hear. And then we pulled things like, just because we were spending thousands and thousands of dollars to be there, it was like, okay, let's just get another couple of extra things just because we're going to be there doing the inspections. We listened to things like the original version of Throwing Your Life Away, which has now leaked online somehow. Songs like that from the 80s that were on cassette tapes. Like we listened to the original versions of the songs Michael was writing for the Bad album. We listened to the 1985 versions of them, like Smooth Criminal, The Way You Make Me Feel, which was called Hot Fever, Dirty Diana, these kind of songs. And it was really, really interesting just to hear, before Quincy Jones would have ever even heard of these songs, how finished they were. They weren't Westlake polished. They weren't Westlake vocals. They weren't the Westlake musicians, but structurally and lyrically and thematically and everything that you would want for a blueprint of a song, they were exactly the same as they ended up being on the final versions. That was really interesting. More to your point about what we found that was like the top three things that were really cool. One of the things that I think about is a song called Remember What I Told You, which is kind of like a little ditty. It's like a 1 minute 30 kind of demo type of thing. Michael with Brad Buxer on piano and strings, just kind of figuring out what this idea could be. and mumbling his way through it, but like beautifully mumbling his way through it. I really hope that's something that fans get to hear at some point. I mean, it's not commercially viable. It's not going to be a hit song, but my God, if the estate would just put that out for free out of the goodness of their hearts, if there is any goodness in their hearts, I'm sure fans would lose their minds over just that short little thing. And it's not, you can't use it for anything else. There's no way the estate can make $1 million off Remember What I Told You. But there's a way they could make millions of people's days by putting something like that out. And I really hope they do, and they probably won't. And that's just not what they're interested in, but I hope that they do.
Now, one thing that you did in the series, which struck me as potentially risky, was you did actually include parts of some unreleased Michael music where it was relevant to, for example, demonstrate that there were two versions of Water and that the Cascio song was not Michael's one. How much deliberation did you give that decision, and were you worried that it could end up getting you sued or something?
Extreme legal scrutiny. We checked that out multiple which ways and really ensured that was, again, back to what I was saying about the choices you make have to be ethical, and they have to be law-abiding, and they have to be within the public interest. And to make claims, Michael had a song that was the same title but different, that's one thing. But then to be able to prove your claim, demonstrating that claim with the actual audio, it gives a different level of credibility to the claim you're making. And of course, as a journalist and someone who's, claiming that they're revealing the truth about the biggest art fraud in history, any claim you make that goes unsubstantiated chips a little bit away from your credibility, possibly. And where we could, we chose to make those decisions where we can prove what we're saying. We're not making this up, and everything that's in this podcast is verifiably true. We have evidence for everything. So where we were able to include that evidence to support our claims, we did. And yeah, we didn't take that lightly. That was like a big, big, big thing about, well, should we or shouldn't we?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it was important to do. And we did it so limited. Like, use 6 seconds of something. It's like, that's not the reason people are coming to this podcast. They're coming to the podcast to find out the truth about the Cascio tracks and the authenticity of the vocals. But, that 6 seconds is just one tiny little piece of a gigantic puzzle. And if that piece can be in place and not missing, then let's put it in place.
Now, Dan, I want to pay tribute again to your work on the show, because what you did was you kind of created the soundscape for the episodes, the way you've blended the narration and the interviews with music and sound effects. I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. And by the way, MJCast listeners, in case you didn't know, Dan also created the MJCast theme music. So Dan, could you just tell our listeners a bit about what you do?
Yeah, well, thank you for your kind words. And it was a very collaborative effort with Damien for sure. And he had a similar vision to mine, so that made things easy. Yeah, I'm a music producer / artist. I compose music, produce music for production libraries, for television and film companies, I guess, to use. I release my own music from time to time, and I was very lucky to have Damien ask me to be part of this project that was just a crazy ride, and I'm very happy that you like it, and I'm happy that a lot of people have responded well to it.
And how are you and Damien sharing the creative decisions? So when we hear a sound effect, when we hear a particular song being used in the background, Charlie Carter, for example, I remember him mentioning to me how he enjoyed the fact that you used money at certain points as a seemingly appointed piece of background music. Who was in the driving seat in terms of all these creative decisions? Where did the ideas come from, and who had the final say?
Well, Damien had the final say. There wasn't a lot of back and forth on things as a whole. I mean, it's a very long podcast. I think we both had, like I say, we had a very similar vision It's funny, to begin with, I didn't even consider making this project as a podcast, and it was Damien who convinced me that there should be a podcast. And so I said, okay, but, can you recommend me things to listen to? And he started sending me things like Up and Vanished and Cold. And I guess we were both kind of inspired by those early immersive, investigative, journalistic podcasts that just sort of take you and transport you to different scenarios. So you can sort of imagine things in your head as you're listening to the narration. Damien would tell me, we should do a scene here where we have the traffic or whatever, and I might say, okay, but how about this? Like for example, in the first episode, we were listening to the Howard Weitzman speech that he made outside the court when they first appointed John Branca and John McClane as the estate executors, and the audio is kind of like, it's mainly recording their voices, his voice, but you can hear a very faint like camera clicking in the background. And I thought, well, what if we just sort of enhance that by adding extra camera shutters and making it a little bit more embellished? And I think Damien sort of liked that idea. So it was kind of like 50-50, I would say. I think we were both conceptualizing along the way. Sometimes, Damien would, of course, write the script and be sort of putting everything together. He would then send me the notes and say, how about a sound effect here or a music transition there? And sometimes it wouldn't work, and I would sort of fight my corner and say, no, I think we should do it this way. And we would sort of go back and forth on a few things. But yeah, it was mostly very collaborative, I would say. Do you agree, Damien? Do I have rose-tinted glasses on my memory?
No. To give more context to how it all came together, initially I wanted to do it as a podcast. And the podcasts that I liked, they did use this kind of like ambient sound, and they built drama with tension, like tense music and whatever. And I had in my mind like how I wanted it to be. And Jamon had actually done like this. He created this teaser video, which was like for what could be some version of something where it was like, and he had this music behind it, and it was a tense type of song. And I was like, this thing that Jamon's done is just so cool. And if I want to do it as a podcast, I'd like to have a couple of tracks that I can just run behind the whole thing. And so initially, I'm trying to convince Dan that, I'm going to do the podcast myself. Don't worry, like, because it's going to be a bit, because in my mind, I'm thinking, I don't want to drag Dan into it because it's going to be a big fucking job. Like, it's going to be a full-time job. And I thought in my mind, this is probably going to be like a full-time job for maybe a few months. And like nobody in their right mind is going to want to spend 10 hours a day, every day, dedicating themselves to something that makes no money, has, no reward, and is, done in your, kitchen bench. Like that's, so I thought I'm not even going to try and ask him or posture to him like, hey, co-produce this with me and like make it for me, basically. So I just said to him, like, Jamon made this cool thing, and here are some podcasts that I like. Get an idea of the music, the ambient tense sounds, and like if you could, please, like, if it's not too much trouble, send me a couple of tracks that I can just slot in under my voice. And Dan kept saying, send me the narration. And I said, no, like, don't worry about it. Like, just send me the track. I'll put it in under there myself. I'll do it myself. Like, just send me the tracks and I'll figure it out. And he kept saying, just send me the narration. And so, okay, one day I was like, oh, fuck it. Okay, I'll send him what I've done.
You didn't want to.
I didn't want to because I was like, he's going to be more than he's expecting. It's going to be like, I don't want him to do more work than he has to do. Just send me the fucking track. So I sent him maybe like 15 minutes of what I'd recorded for episode 1. And then he sent it back to me with little clips of news clips with effects on them. And I was just like, holy fucking shit. This sounds really good. Like, and I said, like, can you imagine if the whole podcast was just like this? Like if we made it like a proper documentary news reporting type of like thing that was I said the movie for people's mind. Like instead of just me talking and then editing in the interviews and just having some kind of like monotonous track behind it, if it was, really produced, like really properly. And I'm getting excited by it, but I'm also not wanting to say that, hey, Dan, do you want to commit to this? And I don't think there ever was a conversation where we said like, are we actually really doing this? It just started happening. And I think there might have been a couple of moments where I was worried that it was becoming too much because it was so good. Like what Dan was doing was so fucking good. And I was just like, I don't want to put a stop to this, but this is getting out of control. And in the outset, I thought it would be a few months of work. There was 2 years where it was just dipping the toes in and like having conversations and creative theorizing about what it could be between 2018 and 2020. And then the pandemic hit. And then it was like, okay, I can't leave the house. I'm going to make this podcast properly. And then Dan was like making it properly with me every day. And it was just unbelievable. Like we would wake up, spend the whole entire day on this thing and then go to sleep and then wake up the next day and start again. And it took 4 fucking years to finish it. And like James said earlier, we needed 14 years to investigate the whole thing and we needed 4 years to produce the whole thing because it wasn't as good as it is in its early iterations. And Charlie, I actually remember sending you the very first draft of episode 1 and your response was like, this is so good, put it out right now. What are you waiting for? Put it out right now. And I was like, it's not as good as it can be. And also it's taking a while to do, a lot longer than I thought. And I'm not going to be able to keep the pace up of like, if this is episode 1, then I'll be able to get episode 2 out in a timely manner. And then episode 3 after episode 2, I want to wait till it's all finished so we can release it all at once. Thank God we waited that time as well, because the interviews, I think like James said, they didn't just fall into our laps. Some of these things like Lawanda came in, we'd finished episodes 1, 2, and 3, and then Lawanda decides she wants to talk. And then, okay, so I'm doing this 4-hour interview with Lawanda, and then I'm like, oh my God, damn, we have to reproduce episode 3, but it's not going to be just episode 3 anymore. I've got so much new content that this is going to be episode 3 and 4 split into 2. And then it's like, actually, it's going to be 3, 4, and 5. And then Tony Curtis wants to talk. And then it's like, oh my God, now we have to rethink the whole thing again because all this new stuff kept coming through the middle of production. And then we had to keep on changing it to introduce all these new people that were coming in. Like these are people we tried to get for 10 years. Like if they would have spoken to us years prior, we probably would have got the podcast done in a year. But it was just that we get to the point where, okay, episode 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 are now done. And okay, now that's going to be episodes 1 through 8. And everything else has to be expanded again. And it just was an ever-evolving process. But it all started with Dan sending me this little clip back when I didn't want him to actually dive into it and put too much work into it because I knew it was going to be a little bit of work. And it just was this rabbit hole of like, it just became something that none of us could have ever imagined it would be.
Damien, one of my favorite memories of working on this project with you was that moment where you and I got to interview Jerome Booker, who was the housemate.
Oh yeah, that was a great one.
Of James Porte back in the day before when he was at uni studying to be an audio engineer or whatever he was doing. I think only a little bit of that made it into Faking Michael. That was also quite a long, interesting conversation where he revealed a lot about James Porte. But I'm curious, after all these years and you having arrived at, the end of the process of when you released the series, the relationship between Eddie Cascio and James Porte. Now, Eddie Cascio and Jason Capetto, Jason Malachi, they get a lot of the blame for this whole fraud. And you do a wonderful job of exploring James Porte's involvement in it as well. But looking back on everything, are you in a position now where you're able to identify how responsible James was as compared to Eddie? Who was the mastermind? Were these two guys working together 50-50? Or was it more James or more Eddie?
It's really hard to say because they brought different things to the table. Like, for example, Eddie Cascio brought the connection to Michael Jackson to the table. James did meet Michael and work fleetingly with him when Michael was recording at the Hit Factory. But it was the fact that Michael was literally family friends with Eddie Cascio that allowed James into the world of Michael Jackson. And like Eddie Cascio says to you, Michael didn't invite many people into his world, and James Porte was one of the people that he liked. He did invite into his world. Creatively and conceptually, as far as the fraud goes, it didn't start as a fraud. It started as James Porte thinking he has this chance to write these songs for Michael Jackson, and that maybe he would get his chance for Michael to record them. And it wasn't an unrealistic thought. James Porte had written songs for other artists that had been recorded, and I'm not just talking about small artists. Like James Porte wrote a song for Luther Vandross, which was one of the last songs that Luther ever recorded, and it was released. He wasn't a nobody in the world of writing and producing ideas for famous artists. Like in the world of R&B, it doesn't get much or any bigger than Luther Vandross. So for him to think that this could be a chance for him to work with Michael Jackson was totally realistic. The concept of the fraud only happens after Michael dies, and after Michael dies, the work has already been done, really. Like the songs have been written. James Porte and Eddie Cascio wrote some songs together. James wrote some songs separately. Eddie wrote some songs on his own. And actually, James and I heard one particular collection that Eddie Cascio had written for Michael Jackson, which James Porte hadn't been involved in. And it was really interesting to hear how different the quality of the craftsmanship was with the demos that Eddie had done without James, as opposed to the songs that James had done without Eddie, or the songs that Eddie and James had done together. Because Eddie's work alone was so inferior. And I mean, you could say it's a little bit rude, but maybe he deserves it. The notes that James and I wrote on our handwritten notepads in the copyright office when we were listening to the Eddie Cascio stuff was like things like, I'm laughing so hard, this is so fucking bad, this guy has no talent. It was night and day compared to the James Porte stuff. So creatively, James Porte's essential, because whether you like the songs or not, or whether you so turned off by the fact that they've turned to fraud that you can't even imagine labeling something that James Porte would create as good, we were unable to say that his songs were bad when we were listening to them. Like the stuff that he had registered with his own voice and that he had crafted, some of which was for himself, some of which was for Michael Jackson, some of which was for other people, other artists, female artists, all kinds of stuff. The guy's a decent talent. He's like, the James Porte versions of the Cascio tracks sound better than the Jason Malachi versions do, by far. Much more authentic, much more genuine. They were written by him. They were sung by him. They sound like they should have been sung by him. But as far as the culpability goes, it takes two to tango, and one can't do it without the other. They have to do it together. And so I don't want to try and attribute the amount of blame that each of them should get. But I mean, James knew that this was going to be a problem because he deleted all of his social media the night before breaking news premiered online. James Porte didn't want anything to do with the public response to what people were going to hear when they would hear breaking news. He wanted nothing to do with it. It disappeared completely. He had a Last.fm profile, deleted it. Had a MySpace profile, deleted it. He disappeared completely. He sent Eddie out into the wild on his own on the Oprah Winfrey Show to talk about how these songs were so real and so authentic and so Michael Jackson. James Porte didn't ever go on television and testify that his fraudulent songs were real. But he did do that he was advocating for his songs very strongly behind the scenes. He was in meetings with the estate arguing that his songs were real. He was rallying Sony Music executives to try and have fans like me arrested for even asking the question or talking about this stuff on Twitter. So there's culpability everywhere you look. And I'll just say that, it takes two to tango, and they did this together, and that's all I'll say. It's a team effort. The whole thing can't be done without the other.
Were you ever able to pinpoint exactly how the two of them initially met? Like, I know James was managing the recording facility where Michael was recording during the Invincible sessions, but were you ever able to identify how these two originally linked up?
Yeah, you did it, and it's in the podcast through your research. I
can't even remember that.
Yeah, no. So we obviously knew that James had met Michael through the Hit Factory. Jerome Booker, who we collectively interviewed, he revealed to us that, the chronology of him meeting James, them studying together, and then James going out into the wild, and he got a job at Battery Studios, which is a Sony-owned studio in New York, and then he moved from Battery Studios to the Hit Factory, and he was working at the Hit Factory, and Michael Jackson comes along and he's recording at the Hit Factory. James Porte, at the beginning of his career at the Hit Factory, was like a second engineer, like an assistant to the engineers. Like if Corey Rooney was a senior vice president at Sony Music in the late 90s. And he was also a songwriter. He worked with Destiny's Child and a bunch of other artists, Jennifer Lopez. And Tommy Mottola, the head of Sony, tasked Corey Rooney with writing songs for Michael Jackson's next new album, which was going to be Invincible. Corey Rooney wrote the song She Was Loving Me, which has been relabeled as Chicago and which was released on the Escape album. He wrote that for Michael in 1999. And Michael rocked up at the Hit Factory to record it with Corey Rooney. James Porte was put on the session, on that recording session. So Michael Jackson, Corey Rooney, and James Porte all in the same room recording She Was Loving Me. And the way Corey Rooney described James Porte at that moment of his career was like, if we wanted a hamburger, James Porte went and got us a hamburger. If we needed some paper, James Porte went and got paper. Like, that was the extent of his involvement in those early stages. And that evolved over time. His duties became more, his responsibility became more, and he became the manager of the Hit Factory eventually. In those Invincible sessions, when Michael was utilizing the Hit Factory, Eddie Cascio was trying to write songs for Michael Jackson to record for the Invincible album. And as you revealed in your interview with Eddie, he told you that Michael flat out said, these songs are not ready. They're not good enough. I'm not going to do them. Keep working. Keep trying to make songs for me. But the way Eddie describes it is that James Porte was someone he trusted to set a studio up for Eddie at Eddie's house. And so Michael linked Eddie and James together and told James, go to Eddie's house and help him set up a studio so he can work on music. And that's how the relationship with Eddie and James started, was that Michael, according to Eddie, put him in Eddie's basement together, basically. And that's where the studio was built, and they started working together. And obviously James is seeing his opportunity to now write songs for Michael Jackson, because he's literally been told by Michael Jackson to go in Eddie Cascio's basement so he can write songs for Michael Jackson. And they collectively started writing songs for Michael Jackson and did so for the next, several years until Michael died.
Now, Damien, you've spoken about how over the years you gained voices. All of a sudden LaWanda wants to speak, and then all of a sudden somebody else wants to speak. But there was one voice that you lost also. So I just want to talk for a moment about Vera Serova, because she is kind of a hero in this story. She is the fan who files the class action lawsuit over the fake songs and fights in the courts for years and eventually wins a settlement which results in the songs being removed from the market. But as a result of that settlement, she was not able to be interviewed for your podcast. So to what extent did the outcome of that court case change the shape of the podcast series?
Dan and I were already 2 years into full-blown, full-time production on the podcast series before there was an outcome to that lawsuit. And so we already had our vision about how this thing was going to be told and what the final episode, I guess the final conclusion was going to be. And at that point, before there was a resolution, I guess the end result was going to be that this is a huge injustice. The songs have never been removed. Sony's never apologized, whatever. So the only difference was that we had an addition, because we were going to talk about the lawsuit, obviously. We wouldn't have had the positive outcome that, the lawsuit had been successful and the songs had come down. I mean, we hadn't got to the point of doing the episodes on the lawsuit at the time the songs came down. So we hadn't had a chance to interview Vera already. And regrettably, I mean, if we would have known how it all would have unfolded in hindsight, Vera would have been the first interview we would have done. It would have been recorded when the case was active and she was able to talk about it and whatever. And then we would have been able to include it, because it would have been like, no, this recording is timestamped, 3 years before the settlement, and it's being included. That's it. Too bad. It's on the record. It's done. I guess that's the only difference, is that if we would have known that we were actually going to win, we would have prepared for that and been able to have her included. But as much as possible, without trying to dive too much into the personal relationships that I have with everybody, because the personal relationships are not in the public interest. But the work that Vera did, we did try our best to document that without her participation as best we could. And it's hard because it's so boring listening to an Australian guy talk about an American lawsuit with a part Russian plaintiff who's actually like just such an amazing person. And if her voice could have been in it, I mean, those voices like Lawanda, like Tony Curtis, like Michael Prince, these people are so compelling. When you listen to them and you hear their story and you understand the passion and the conviction from which they operate, it's just so evident in their voice. And it would have been amazing to have Vera in the podcast, but it just wasn't to be. And yeah, the only difference it would have been that you would have heard her telling her story, and you didn't get to hear it, but you may never get to hear it. But it's a shame. It's a massive shame. But yeah, that's the only real curveball that the settlement brought, was that she couldn't be in it. But we can still talk about Vera's case and everything. There's nothing that can't be spoken about. It's just that she can't do it herself.
Now, Jamon, there's obviously been a massive development in the past year where information has emerged that in 2019, the Cascio family used the threat of potential abuse allegations against Michael to obtain millions of dollars from his estate. And then in 2024, the family came back and demanded another $213 million and have retained the services of Mark Geragos and are threatening to sue for alleged molestation. And as we've heard today with Eddie, very emphatically dismissing any suggestion of Michael being a child molester, describing it as ridiculous and saying that he spent many nights in Michael's room and even in the same bed as him, and he knows that nothing happened. So, as it turns out, you have been sitting on an extremely important account.
I asked him that question before Leaving Neverland had happened. And as fans will probably remember, when the Wade Robson allegations broke, and I think it was on some kind of morning TV show or something like that, when he talked about it, it wasn't really worldwide news, I would say. It was certainly discussed in the fan community and it angered a lot of fans, but it wasn't like seismic news that was talked about by people day to day in real life. I don't think it really had an impact on Michael's legacy at all when Wade first discussed what he was claiming. It wasn't until Leaving Neverland happened that a lot shifted, particularly because it was happening around the time of, Me Too and Time's Up and the way the media really ran with it. So I think that it's very different now. Michael's reputation is in the balance again in the public mind share in a way that it wasn't when I asked the question. So yes, I understand the importance of the account, and I would also just hope that the judge that's dealing with the arbitration case and whatever that develops into, hopefully nothing, but if these legal situations keep developing and the Cassios keep making claims, then I think it's important for the judge and the court to really consider their history. The way that Frank Cascio has behaved over the years in terms of what he's tried to auction constantly to try to make money off Michael's name. The way that Eddie has perpetrated this fraud, which is proven in the Faking Michael series. All of this needs to be taken into account. The history of the Cascio family needs to be taken into account. Sure, they might be making claims, but just like the other accusers that have made abuse claims against Michael Jackson, the only people that have made claims are people that consistently and provably lie and try to make money off Michael Jackson.
One thing that confuses me right now about all the reporting that's sort of trickling out about what the Cassios have cooking in arbitration, because that's currently where it stands. In all the reporting on it, even in official arbitration documents, there seems to be no mention at all of the previous relationship between the estate and these parties, which resulted in a fraud that went all the way to the California Supreme Court. And it's as if the Cassios have come out of nowhere all of a sudden with these claims. And it's like, well, what about your relationship from the year 2010 to whenever the Supreme Court case was, 2018 or whatever? What about the millions in payouts then? What about the legal fees of that? What about the outcome of that fraud? What about the fact that it is a fraud? Why isn't this a factor? Why aren't you guys, the estate, speaking to the estate, why aren't you guys tweeting and sharing faking Michael? And I think you can go down like a conspiratorial path, but I don't think you have to. I think it lends to what I had said earlier, which is that this whole thing was about the estate's authority. And they refused to relinquish the fact they botched Michael's posthumous release creatively. They botched it big time. And they're so hell-bent on maintaining that authority that even when it would be very useful to say, yeah, we got defrauded and they're frauds, they won't do that. That's like a little disturbing, to be honest. Like, talk about power trip.
Well, and look how it's come back to bite them in the arse, because now these very same people are threatening to make damaging allegations in pursuit of a very large sum of money. And what has the estate spent the last decade or so doing? It spent the last decade or so in courts of law insisting that the Cascio family are not con artists and that they are telling the truth about everything. So, I know hindsight is 20/20, but Damien, with hindsight, looking back on the estate's decisions in regard to the Cascio tracks, today, how would you assess the wisdom of their decision to defend the Cassios and their songs, as opposed to calling them out and seeking retribution at the time?
Well, I don't need hindsight to make this assessment. I vividly recall back when Twitlonger was a thing, making a post saying that this type of behavior from the estate, allowing and defending such an egregious fraud, such an egregious attack on the truth in the context of Michael's legacy, but like in any capacity, to allow people who are walking through the door telling a lie about Michael Jackson with their hand out for money, this sets a dangerous precedent to allow anybody else in the future who may want to walk through the door with their lie about Michael Jackson and their hand out for money to say that, we, the estate of Michael Jackson, don't stand on the side of the truth. We won't stop fraudsters from lying about Michael Jackson with their hands out for money. And in fact, we will defend people who lie with their hands out for money, and we may even put that money in your hands if you're so lucky. That's the perception I had of it in the moment when it happened in 2010. So, the hindsight is exactly what I thought it could be. It's a very, very dangerous move that they made. Like at that moment, being the victims of a fraud, or weighing up about whether it's more valuable for them to actually be a victim of fraud, a willing victim of fraud, and to defend the fraud and to try and commercially exploit the fraud for their own personal benefit, which is what they ended up doing. I think they made a very, very foolish decision to do that. But, the estate does these things more often than they should. I mean, I don't want to dive down rabbit holes and start bringing out too many different examples and getting off topic here. But like, just look at the example of Michael Bush. John Branco wrote the foreword for Michael Bush's book. And the estate has invited Michael Bush to, I think it's 10 or 11 consecutive annual Michael Jackson birthday events at Las Vegas for him to come and do his Michael Bush book signing event. And this is somebody who literally auctioned items with dubious signatures of Michael Jackson on them, one of which we can prove definitively is a fraudulent signature, because the item he auctioned was a cardboard cutout that was manufactured by Bravado in a deal with the estate that was done after Michael had died, and it's signed "To Bush, Love Michael Jackson." And this is a person who the estate continues to associate with. He was at their fucking event like just a few weeks ago, signing his book with John Branca's foreword in it. John Branca and Michael Bush have a fucking collaborative YouTube channel where they talk about Michael Jackson's influence on fashion. This is a very weird and bizarre world to exist in. And the estate has proven several times that the truth is not necessarily what's important to them. It's the exploitation of stories that they can use to their own benefit to posture themselves as experts on Michael Jackson. Oh, look, we work with Michael Bush, his longtime costume creator. Oh, we've got these songs from his longtime friend, Eddie Cascio. Yeah, but that guy's a fraud. And yeah, but that guy's a fraud too. And you're still working with them. Why are you doing that? And with Eddie and the Cascio family and the songs, it's come back to bite them hard. Not to say that it ever will with Michael Bush, but like still it's a fraud and shouldn't be allowed to happen. And especially not on the watch of executors whose fiduciary duty is to protect Michael's estate from being the victim of these things. When they've just not only allowed it to happen, but just platform these people, put them on Oprah Winfrey, put them in a documentary, use their songs after a scandal, then try and use their songs again in a Cirque du Soleil show, which they tried to do with the Cascio Tracks. These people don't learn their lessons, and it makes you wonder, are they as smart as they think they are?
Now, before we wrap up, Damien, what is next? Will there ever be more episodes? And I know that you do have a plan for a book. So just tell us about what's next. What is the next chapter in Faking Michael?
Yeah, so the book is still something that I would like to do. But since the release of the podcast, I've had to migrate myself back into everyday life, start, acting like a normal adult and take responsibility for the bills that I have and all of those things, which really got neglected for 14 years while I was pursuing the completion of the investigation and the removal of the songs and the release of the podcast and all the things that were important to us that we wanted to do and have done and achieved. There is more to tell, like there are different perspectives and there is kind of much more information that didn't make it in the podcast. It would be interesting for people to learn. And also the story, perhaps a little bit more from my own journey, because I tried to keep myself out of the podcast as a character as much as I could, because it shouldn't be the Damien Shields show. It's Faking Michael. The book version may give me an opportunity to do a little bit more of like the journey side of things and how we all kind of did this in a similar way to what this episode is doing. But I don't know what the time frame on the book is. It's just because everyday life is now the thing that's consuming me, and I don't have, my days dedicated to sitting down and working on this. So let's see what comes of it. And then the other thing that I think would be a dream come true, and I would truly make me consider the whole Faking Michael conversation closed, would be a documentary version of that. There's been conversations that have been had between myself and certain people in filmmaking industry about bringing that idea to fruition. Serious conversations. Nothing has come of that yet, so there's nothing really to tell. It's an area that I'm interested in. If the right opportunity presents itself, I would really, really consider the whole thing to be over and done, and I don't have to talk about it anymore ever again if there were a documentary version. It's my favorite kind of medium. That's my favorite way to consume information, and that would be just like something so great, but way beyond the means of what any of us have to produce. So it would have to involve the participation of somebody else or a team of people, professionals who can do that type of thing. And beyond that, the future is a mystery. I have no idea what my life looks like beyond this, but with Faking Michael, that's it in a nutshell. So yeah, stay tuned, but don't stay tuned on the edge of your seat expecting something tomorrow.
Season 2.
Yeah, season 2. There's nothing forthcoming right now, and I wish there could be something more urgently forthcoming, but my life just doesn't. I can't do it. I mean, we can't work on these passion projects for free for our whole lives, otherwise we'll end up homeless and hungry, and that's the trajectory that I was on at the very pointy end of the completion of the podcast. I'd neglected my ability to survive as an adult in the world far too much, and I'm just kind of keeping my head above water now, playing catch up and trying to have a normal adult life, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I haven't got anything that I'm going to get off this call and go and start working on, and I've got no announcements impending. So When there is something to tell, I'll tell it. But right now, there's nothing to tell.
Well, you've done enough for the time being, and thank you for doing it. And on that note, thank you to all of you for joining us on the show today. Now, Damien, if people want to listen to Faking Michael and they haven't yet done it, where can they find it?
Faking Michael is available on all major podcast platforms. So typically people will listen either on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It's also available on YouTube. It's an audio only. It's important to stipulate it's an audio only podcast. It is on YouTube, but there is no visual component to it. And well, we have a website with nothing on there, so probably don't bother visiting that unless you've got new information you want to contribute and put it in the contact form. But yeah, podcast applications is where you'll find it. If you do listen to it, please leave us a comment, rate the podcast, tell us what you think, reach out. We're always happy to hear from people who've listened to it and have their thoughts, and we appreciate all the listenership that we have had so far, and we are grateful for any new listenership that will come to us in the future. Thank you to the MJCast for having us on, which will only open more doors for more listeners who haven't perhaps listened yet. And yeah.
What about social media? Is there a Faking Michael social media page they should follow for updates?
Yes, there is. I don't think it's been used very frequently in the last 9 months or so, but we are on Twitter. I think it's at Faking MJ Podcast. Instagram is at Faking Michael Podcast, and search for it on Facebook. I literally have not signed into that Facebook page for a year, so I don't even know how to find it, but search for Faking Michael on Facebook. There might be something that you'll find. I don't know. And my own personal social media is just at Damien Shields on Twitter and Instagram. But these days I barely interact on social media. Every now and then I'll troll the estate for their abhorrent administration of Michael Jackson's social media. But I'm just basically sending memes via inbox messages to the people who use the platforms that I use, and then texting them to Jamon because he's not on there.
Thank you.
And Dan, how about you? How can people follow you and find out more about your work?
You can go to my website, danvillalobos.com, or for all the links, you can find me on most streaming platforms, or on Twitter at VillalobosDan, or Instagram at Dan Villalobos Music.
James, are you interested in being followed on social media, or do you want to remain anonymous?
Anonymous.
Oh, if we're not interested in being followed, don't follow me.
Jamon's not on any social media, so if you want to follow the MJCast, then unsurprisingly, we're on all the social media platforms as the MJCast. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you guys all for joining us today. It's been a great discussion, and it's gone pretty smoothly. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.
Very good.
There we go.
All right.
That's a wrap.
Thanks so much.